I never believed in giants. For most of my life, I accepted what I was taught in school, what historians and archaeologists presented as settled fact. The idea of enormous human beings walking the earth seemed like myth, like folklore, not reality. I assumed the scale of our buildings had always been designed for people roughly our size. But then I started looking at old photographs from the 19th century, and something began to shift in my understanding. It started innocently enough. I was researching architectural history, looking at images of buildings from the 1800s. I kept noticing something that seemed odd. The doorways in many of these structures were enormous, not just tall, but proportionally massive. I told myself this was simply a stylistic choice, that Victorian architects enjoyed grand entrances. That explanation satisfied me for a while, but the more images I examined, the more this explanation began to feel insufficient. In photograph after photograph, I saw doors that towered over the people standing beside them. Not by a comfortable margin, but by proportions that seemed almost wasteful if these structures were built for people of average height. A door that reaches 12 or 14 feet high requires significantly more material, more labor, more structural support. It represents considerable additional expense. I began to ask myself why builders across different cities, different countries, would consistently make this same costly choice if it served no practical purpose. Then I started noticing the windows. In many buildings from this period, the first floor windows sit remarkably high off the ground. The standard explanation suggests these elevated windows were for security or privacy. But when you look at the frequency of this design feature, when you see it repeated in structures that serve different purposes, the security explanation begins to seem partial at best. A window placed 8 or 9 feet off the ground serves security, yes, but it also suggests the person looking out from inside might have been considerably taller than we are. I found myself examining furniture in these old photographs with new attention. There are images of chairs from the 19th century that appear oddly proportioned when people sit in them. The seats seem too deep, the backs too tall, the armrests positioned in ways that look uncomfortable for someone of typical height. Museum catalogs sometimes note these pieces as unusually large examples or attribute the sizing to regional stylistic preferences. But when you encounter these unusual examples repeatedly across different regions, the explanation becomes less convincing. The staircases troubled me particularly. Many feature steps with risers significantly taller than what modern building codes recommend. Today, we understand that a step height of about 7 to 8 inches is optimal for human comfort and safety. Yet in numerous photographs from this period, I could see staircases where each step appeared to be 10, 11, even 12 inches high. People often appeared to be stepping up with considerable effort. Why would builders consistently create staircases that made movement through buildings more difficult unless those staircases were designed for people who found those proportions comfortable? I looked at photographs of city streets, particularly storefronts and commercial buildings. The ground floors often feature ceilings that seem excessively high. A retail shop with a 16-foot ceiling is paying to heat and maintain a volume of space that serves no obvious commercial advantage if the proprietors and customers are all between 5 and 6 feet tall. It simply exists as empty space above people's heads, unless the people for whom these spaces were originally designed needed that vertical clearance. I began examining photographs of industrial equipment from the 19th century. There are images of tools and machinery that seem scaled beyond what would be necessary for workers of average size. I found photographs of hammers with handles so long that a person of typical height would struggle to wield them effectively, of wrenches with grips that seemed designed for much larger hands. The standard explanation suggests tools were sometimes made larger for increased leverage, but it doesn't explain the consistency of the scaling across so many different implements from this period. Photographs of residential interiors show similar peculiarities. I studied images of bedrooms where the beds appear enormous, extending well beyond what someone of average height would need. Kitchen photographs show counters at heights that seem impractical. Door frames within houses often reach 8, 9, 10 feet tall for no apparent reason if everyone in the household stood between 5 and 6 feet. I came across photographs of chairs from government buildings or civic structures. These chairs had seats elevated so high that an average-sized person sitting in them would have their feet dangling well above the floor, like a child in furniture made for adults. The official designation often labels these as ceremonial chairs meant to elevate officials symbolically. But the construction seemed too practical for pure symbolism, as if they were designed for someone who actually needed a seat at that height to sit comfortably. The documentation from archaeological work in the 19th century began to interest me. There are numerous newspaper accounts from that period describing the discovery of unusually large skeletal remains. These reports appear in local papers across America, across Europe, across different continents. They describe bones of remarkable size being unearthed during construction projects. The newspapers treated these discoveries as notable but not sensational, reporting them matter-of-factly. The descriptions are often quite specific, mentioning measurements and locations. The standard explanation from modern archaeology suggests these reports were either hoaxes, misidentifications of animal bones, or exaggerations by untrained observers. This certainly accounts for some cases, but the sheer number of these reports, the geographical spread, the consistency of descriptions, makes blanket dismissal feel incomplete. If these were all hoaxes, who was perpetrating them and for what purpose? If they were all misidentifications, why do so many descriptions include specific details about human anatomical features? I found myself looking at photographs of people posed next to architectural elements, using human figures as scale references. In image after image, the same pattern emerges. A man standing next to a doorway barely reaches 2/3 of its height. A woman beside a window has to reach far above her head to touch the sill. A group of workers at a factory entrance disappears into the shadow of an opening that seems designed for something much larger. Individually, each photograph might be explained away. But when you line up dozens of these images, all showing the same proportional relationships, the individual explanations begin to feel like excuses rather than observations. There are photographs showing residential buildings where each floor has ceiling heights that seem excessive by modern standards. I calculated that some structures had first floors with ceilings reaching 14 or 15 feet. The entire building stands taller than would be structurally necessary if housing people of ordinary size. The additional height means more material, more complex roof structures, more difficulty heating. Builders in the 19th century were practical people working within budgets. They didn't add unnecessary height without reason. I examined photographs of public buildings, courthouses, train stations, libraries. These structures often feature main halls with ceiling heights that seem almost cavernous. The standard explanation points to grandeur, appropriate for civic architecture, the desire to create spaces that inspire awe. But there's a difference between high ceilings, meant to create an impression, and spaces that seem scaled for actual use by larger occupants. When I look at photographs showing people in these spaces, they often appear diminished, not by artistic intent, but by genuine proportional mismatch. The photographs of industrial facilities show massive internal spaces with structural elements sized beyond what the machinery would seem to require. I found images of factories where ceiling clearance above equipment leaves vast amounts of unused vertical space. A modern engineer would likely question the inefficiency, the wasted volume that must be heated, the unnecessary structural support. Unless the workers who operated this machinery needed that clearance to move comfortably in spaces we find cavernous. I started paying attention to the doors themselves, not just their height, but their construction. In many photographs, these enormous doors are heavily built with thick timbers and substantial hardware, suggesting they were designed to be regularly used, not just decorative. A door meant only for show might be built more lightly, but these doors show construction of functional elements, with hinges sized to handle regular movement, with handles positioned for use, with thresholds showing wear from foot traffic. Church architecture particularly caught my attention. Religious structures have traditionally featured high ceilings and large doorways for symbolic reasons. But I began noticing that many smaller churches and meeting houses feature similar proportions without theological justification. A small rural church serving a modest congregation would have no particular reason to build a doorway towering 12 or 13 feet high if it served no practical purpose. The community would have limited resources, practical concerns about cost. Why make the entry so massive if only used by people of ordinary height? I found photographs showing bank and office building interiors. The teller windows and service counters often appear positioned at heights that seem inconvenient. Customers sometimes appear to be reaching up to conduct business. Modern ergonomic understanding tells us these arrangements would cause discomfort during long working hours. Yet these designs appear repeatedly. Were the architects simply ignorant of comfortable working heights, or were they designing for users whose proportions differed from those we see in the photographs? There are photographs showing street scenes where you can observe the relationship between people and their built environment. In many images, the pedestrians look almost diminished by their surroundings, not in the way grand architecture is meant to humble the observer, but in a way suggesting fundamental mismatch of scale. A person walking past storefronts appears small because the ordinary commercial structures seem sized for larger occupants. The awnings extend higher than necessary. The display windows begin at heights above easy viewing level. I examined photographs of street furniture from this period: lampposts, benches, fountains. Many seem scaled larger than modern equivalents. A lamppost from the 1800s often stands considerably taller than contemporary street lighting, placing the light source at a height that seems less efficient for illuminating where people walk. These are utilitarian objects designed for daily use, yet they follow the same pattern of enlarged scale. The photographic record shows construction sites capturing buildings in various stages of completion. In these images, you can sometimes see structural elements before they're covered by finishing materials. What strikes me is that the beams and columns often appear heavier, more substantial than modern building science would suggest is necessary for structures of these sizes. An engineer today might conclude they're overbuilt, containing more material than required for the loads they need to support, unless those loads included occupants proportioned differently than we assume. I found myself looking at photographs of disaster scenes, images taken after fires or collapses where internal structure becomes visible. In these images, you can sometimes see multiple floors exposed like a cross-section, revealing spacing between levels. The vertical distances often appear generous beyond what seems practical. Each additional foot of floor-to-floor height represents substantial additional cost, labor, ongoing expense. Why would builders consistently choose to space floors so far apart if it served no functional purpose? There are photographs showing groups posed in front of buildings. In many of these images, the building behind the group seems disproportionately large, not in a way that a small group might look diminished by a large structure, but suggesting the structure was designed for a different scale of human being. The doorway visible behind the group rises far above the tallest person present. The proportional relationship feels off in a way that's consistent across many images. I began collecting images of specific architectural details, focusing on elements with clear functional purposes. Service doors, loading docks, secondary entrances meant for deliveries or employees. These utilitarian elements have no reason to be larger than necessary. Yet in photograph after photograph, I found these functional elements sized at scales similar to the grand public entrances. A loading dock door stands 10 or 11 feet tall. These aren't spaces anyone would see unless they had business there. There's no one to impress. Why build them so large if everyone using them was of ordinary height? The photographs of residential streets show houses that follow similar proportional patterns. These aren't mansions. They're ordinary middle-class homes, workers' housing. Yet many feature front doors that seem oversized, windows positioned higher than seems practical, roof lines that sit taller than modern houses of similar footprint. When you see an entire street of houses all following this same pattern, the explanation of aesthetic choice becomes less convincing. I came across photographs showing shop and store interiors. The shelving often reaches heights that would require ladders for a person of average height to access the upper levels. The modern explanation suggests efficient use of vertical space. But the upper shelves are often too high to be conveniently accessed, even with a stepladder, which would be cumbersome in a retail environment. Unless those upper shelves were meant to be accessed by someone who didn't need a ladder. The documentation of infrastructure projects from this period, bridges, tunnels, viaducts, often includes specifications that seem generous in their clearances and dimensions. A bridge might have vertical clearance well beyond what traffic would require. Modern engineers might assume the builders were planning for future growth, but that assumes long-term planning that seems optimistic, given these structures were built to serve immediate needs with limited budgets. I looked at photographs of mining operations. The mine entrances often appear as large openings with clearances that seem generous for people of ordinary height who would be bent over anyway in underground spaces. Modern mining operations are designed with careful attention to excavation costs, removing only necessary material. Why would 19th century miners, working with more primitive equipment, consistently excavate spaces larger than their own bodies required? There are photographs showing ceremonial events where temporary structures have been erected. These temporary elements, viewing stands, decorative arches, often follow the same proportional patterns as permanent architecture. A viewing stand features stairs with tall risers. A ceremonial arch rises to dimensions that dwarf the people passing beneath. These temporary structures represent pure expense since they'll be dismantled after single use. Yet they're consistently built at scales that seem oversized for the people who use them. The photographs of educational institutions show similar architectural patterns. Classroom doors that rise far above students and teachers. Windows positioned high on walls. Desks and chairs that appear sized inconsistently with the people using them. These are functional spaces where comfort and practicality should be primary concerns, where there's no particular benefit to making things larger than necessary. The photographic documentation of expositions and World's Fairs shows enormous temporary structures built to house exhibitions. These buildings were meant to stand for only months, yet they were constructed with the same proportional generosity as permanent architecture. The doorways towered, the ceilings soared, creating real practical problems for heating. Organizers documented complaints about how difficult it was to keep these buildings comfortable. Why build them so large if everyone attending was of ordinary height? There are photographs showing theater and opera house interiors. The seats appear spaced generously, with more room between rows than modern designers typically provide. The aisles seem wider than necessary. These are commercial venues where owners would have financial incentive to fit as many paying customers as possible. The generous spacing represents lost revenue. Why would theater owners consistently choose to fit fewer seats if everyone attending was roughly the same size we are today? I came across photographs showing religious artifacts and furnishings. Some appear scaled larger than their function would require. A pulpit with stairs leading to a speaking platform, positioned much higher than necessary for a person of average height to be seen by the congregation. These are sacred objects, carefully designed with considerable expense. The proportions would have been deliberate choices, not accidents. The photographs of domestic servant spaces, the kitchens, laundries, storage rooms sometimes show the same proportional patterns as public spaces. A servant staircase with steps as tall as the main staircase. If the scale of architecture was purely about display, about impressing visitors, you might expect service areas to be built more modestly. But they often follow the same patterns. I found photographs showing street vendors and merchants. The temporary structures these vendors used, the carts and stalls, sometimes appear sized in ways that seem awkward for the people using them. A vendor has to reach up to access goods stored on their own cart. These are people working with equipment they probably built themselves. Why would they consistently build equipment at scales that made their own work more difficult? The photographic record includes images of disasters that damaged buildings and revealed their internal construction. In these images, you can sometimes see how thick the walls were, how massive the structural elements, how buildings were constructed with materials and methods that seem excessive for the loads they needed to carry, if those loads consisted only of furnishings and people of ordinary size. The documentation of military facilities sometimes describes spaces and elements sized beyond what records suggest would be necessary for soldiers of recorded recruitment heights. A barracks building with beds spaced far apart and ceiling heights creating excess volume to heat. Military organizations are typically efficient about resource allocation. Waste in military construction means less money for weapons and training. I found myself returning to the simple question of expense. Every foot of additional height in a building, every inch of extra width in a doorway represents real cost. In an era before cheap energy and abundant materials, these costs would have been carefully considered. The consistent choice to build at scales beyond what ordinary-sized humans require suggests this scale served some purpose that justified the expense. The photographic record is just one category of evidence. There are written accounts, newspaper reports, personal letters, official documents from the 19th century that describe things that don't quite fit with our current understanding. Descriptions of discoveries that have been explained away or forgotten. References to people of unusual size that have been dismissed as exaggerations. Records of events that seem disconnected from the narrative we've been taught. I'm not claiming to have definitive answers. I'm not asserting that I understand exactly what happened or why our current historical narrative might be incomplete. What I am saying is that when you look carefully at the physical evidence that remains, patterns emerge that are difficult to explain within our standard historical framework. The scale of things seems off in ways that are subtle enough to overlook individually, but compelling when repeated across different contexts, regions, and time periods. The question that keeps returning to my mind is simple but profound. If the built environment of the 19th century was designed for people significantly larger than average modern humans, where are those people in the historical record? Why don't we have clear documentation of their existence? Why have the skeletal remains that were apparently discovered and reported in numerous sources disappeared or been explained away? What happened to create the world we see in these photographs? A world where the buildings seem too large for their inhabitants. I don't know if we'll ever fully understand what was lost or forgotten from our history. I don't know if the explanations we've been given for these anomalies are incomplete or if I'm simply seeing patterns where none exist. What I do know is that the photographs remain. The buildings, many of them, still stand. The proportions can be measured. The relationships between human figures and their environment can be observed. And those observations raise questions that deserve to be asked, even if we don't yet have answers that fully satisfy.